It was a morning of terrifying beauty. The date was July 1, 1916. The place was the Somme River Valley in northern France. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, promising the heat of a sweltering summer day. The skylarks, small brown birds native to the region, were singing high above the chalk fields, their melodies drifting down over the trenches. For a few brief moments at 7:28 a.m., there was a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the silence of a held breath. It was the silence of an executioner raising the axe. Below the singing birds, 100,000 British soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in the chalky trenches, bayonets fixed, eyes fixed on the ladders they were about to climb. They were the volunteer army, the pride of the British Empire, the finest generation their nation had ever produced. They were waiting for a whistle. And tens of thousands of them had less than 1 hour left to live. To understand the horror of what happened next, we must understand the delusion that preceded it. For 7 days and 7 nights leading up to this moment, the British artillery had unleashed hell upon the German lines. 1.5 million shells had been fired. It was the greatest bombardment in the history of warfare up to that point. The noise was so immense it could be heard in London, hundreds of miles away. The sky remained a permanent bruised orange from the explosions. The British High Command was absolutely certain of the result. They believed that nothing could survive this storm of steel. General Rawlinson had told his subordinates that the wire would be cut to ribbons and the German trenches would be pulverized. He told his men that they would not even need their rifles. He told them they would simply walk across no man's land and take possession of a graveyard. This belief was so absolute that the soldiers were issued a fatal order. They were told not to run. They were told not to rush. They were told to advance at a steady walking pace, in orderly lines, 2 to 3 paces apart. They were burdened with 60 pounds of equipment, sandbags, shovels, pickaxes, ammunition, water, and rations. They were not dressed for an assault, they were dressed as pack mules, carrying supplies to occupy trenches they believed were already empty. But the bombardment had failed. It was a catastrophic failure of industrial scale. Many of the British shells were shrapnel shells, designed to kill men in the open, utterly useless against concrete bunkers and barbed wire. Furthermore, the manufacturing quality was poor. Nearly 1/3 of the shells fired were duds that buried themselves in the mud without exploding. But the most critical failure lay deep underground. The Germans were not dead. They were the hardest soldiers in the world, and they had dug deep. Their dugouts were 30, sometimes 40 feet beneath the chalk, reinforced with concrete and timber, complete with electricity and ventilation. For 7 days, they sat in the dark, playing cards, trembling as the earth shook above them, waiting for the drumming to stop. And at 7:30 a.m., the drumming stopped. A series of massive mines were detonated under the German strongpoints, erupting like volcanoes and throwing earth thousands of feet into the air. This was the signal. Along a 15-mile front, thousands of officer whistles blew in unison. The sound was shrill and thin against the vastness of the landscape. Over the top, lads. 100,000 men climbed the ladders. They emerged into the blinding sunlight. They formed their lines, just as they had been trained on the parade grounds of England. They began the long, slow walk toward the German lines. Down in the dark, the German sentries yelled the alarm. The bombardment was over. The attack was coming. The German infantry rushed up the steep dugout stairs, dragging their heavy MG-08 Maxim machine guns. They reached their parapets, blinking in the sudden light. They looked out across the field and they could not believe what they saw. They did not see soldiers rushing from cover to cover. They saw solid waves of men, walking upright, walking slowly, offering themselves as perfect targets. The German gunners adjusted their sights. They clamped their thumbs on the triggers. And the slaughter began. It was not a battle. It was a harvest. The Maxim guns, capable of firing 500 rounds per minute, began to traverse back and forth, creating a geometric pattern of death that was impossible to escape. The British soldiers, weighed down by their 60-pound packs, could not run. They could not drop and roll. They simply bowed their heads and walked into the lead. Entire battalions were erased in seconds. In the northern sector, near the village of Serra, the carnage was absolute. The PALS battalions, units formed of men from the same towns, the same streets, the same factories, died together. The Accrington PALS, the Barnsley PALS, the Leeds PALS. These men had joined up together, trained together, and now they fell together. In the chaotic noise of the battlefield, there was a sickening, rhythmic thudding as bullets struck flesh. At Beaumont Hamel, the Newfoundland regiment attacked. They were not even in the front line trenches. They had to climb out of the reserve trenches and walk over open ground just to reach the British front line. They were silhouetted against the sky. The German gunners focused everything on them. Of the 801 men from Newfoundland who attacked that morning, the next day only 68 were able to answer their names at roll call. The unit was effectively annihilated in 20 minutes. It was said that the German machine gunners eventually stopped firing at the wounded because they were sickened by the pile of bodies growing before their eyes. The tragedy was compounded by the barbed wire. The artillery was supposed to have cut it. It had not. The wire was thick, rusted, and tangled, forming an impenetrable barrier just yards from the German trenches. As the surviving British troops reached the German lines, they found no gaps. They were forced to crowd together, searching for a way through, bunching up into desperate clusters. The Germans threw hand grenades into these huddled masses. Men were left hanging on the wire, riddled with bullets, looking like rags left out to dry. In the confusion, communication lines were cut. The commanders in the rear had no idea of the disaster unfolding. They saw only the smoke and dust. Believing the first wave had succeeded, they sent in the second wave, and then the third. Thousands more men were fed into the meat grinder, marching over the bodies of their friends, only to be cut down by the same relentless machine guns. The heat rose as the day went on. The battlefield became a hellscape of thirst and agony. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, blood, and bowels. In no man's land, the carpet of khaki-clad bodies was so thick that in some places the ground was invisible. The wounded lay trapped in shell holes, calling out for water, calling out for their mothers, baking under the relentless July sun. The snipers waited for any movement. To lift a head was to die. There were moments of unimaginable heroism amidst the waste. The 36th Ulster Division, men from Northern Ireland, actually succeeded. They stormed the German trenches, showcasing incredible ferocity, taking the Schwaben redoubt. But they had advanced too far. They were surrounded, cut off from support, and slowly pounded into oblivion by German artillery. They had done the impossible, and they paid for it with their lives. As the sun finally began to set, the firing slowly died down. The exhaustion on both sides was total. The British survivors crawled back to their own lines, dragging their wounded comrades. The roll calls began, and the true scale of the catastrophe became apparent. Sergeants stood with clipboards, shouting names into the twilight, and receiving only silence in return. Smith. Silence. Jones. Silence. Taylor. Silence. 57,470 men had become casualties. 19,240 of them were dead. It was the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. It remains the bloodiest day. In just 12 hours, the British Empire suffered more dead than in the entire Crimean War, Boer War, and Korean War combined. The impact of July 1st went far beyond the battlefield. Because of the PALS battalions, the grief was localized and concentrated. When the telegrams began to arrive in Britain a few days later, they didn't just come one by one. They came in sacks. Entire streets in London, Liverpool, Manchester, and Glasgow had their curtains drawn. There were villages where every single eligible young man had died on that one morning. The social fabric of the nation was torn apart. The innocence of the Edwardian era was murdered on the slopes of the Somme. The Battle of the Somme would continue for another 4 months. It would grind on through the autumn rains and the winter mud. It would eventually claim over 1 million casualties on all sides. But the first day stands alone. It stands as a monument to the collision between old-world chivalry and modern industrial slaughter. It was the day the world learned that bravery is no match for ballistics. It was the day the sun shone bright, the birds sang, and a generation walked into the dark. The guns of the Somme have long since fallen silent, and the fields of France are green once more. But the echoes of that day still ring in our history, reminding us of the cost of war. If you believe, as I do, that these stories must never be forgotten, if you want to stand with us as we uncover the darkest and most pivotal moments of our past, then please, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It is your support that allows us to keep these memories alive and ensure that the lessons of history are not lost. I read every comment, so tell me below, which battlefield should we visit next? Thank you for watching, and for remembering with us.